Welcome to Wellness with John. Not surprisingly, I'm John, and this channel is my opportunity to share resources with you to help you handle stress and thrive. And so, in today's video, I'm going to talk a little bit about how grief does not happen in stages. Okay, so in this video, I want to talk a little bit about grief. This is not going to be a comprehensive treatment of the topic of grief, but the first installment in a series of videos on the topic of grief. So stay tuned for more in-depth exploration of how to think about and process and work through grief. But in this video, I want to talk about one aspect of how we think about grief, which is the conventional stage model and how it's simply not true. So you may be familiar with the 5 stages of grief, which include denial, anger, bargaining, depression, and acceptance, right? So that's the conventional model. And I want to talk for a little bit about how we got to that model, why it's so pervasive, and why we need to unhook from it, meaning you and me and everybody. We have to unhook from our commitment to that model because it actually creates some problems. And so I'm going to tell you the way we therapists approach the idea of the process of grief, not with the stage model. Okay, so the stage model was popularized and is attributed to Elizabeth Kubler-Ross. And Elizabeth Kubler-Ross was getting her doctorate in clinical psychology in the 60s, 1960s. And she was writing about grief and adjustment to loss. And the population of subjects that she was studying to develop her model and publish her thesis and then write a popular book, which is still popular, today. The population that she was working with were people who had gotten a terminal diagnosis. And so she was studying how people adjusted to getting a terminal diagnosis through the ends of their lives and how the people connected to them were also dealing with the adjustment of the upcoming and then loss of the person. So that was her pool. And so before I tell you what Elizabeth Kubler-Ross deduced and why it's so attractive and has remained attractive, I want to pause for a second with her and say that Kubler-Ross was writing in a particular historical moment that was influenced by Sigmund Freud. So Kubler-Ross is writing in the 1960s. If we go back in time to the earlier part of the 20th century, Sigmund Freud is writing his stuff in the 1920s. And so part of what Freud put out, and is still popular today for people who are more committed than I am to Freud's psychoanalytic model, Freud put out this idea that human development psychologically started at birth and then went through these stages. And they were the so-called Freudian psychosexual stages of development. And Freud thought that we're born at the beginning, we go through a process of sequentially, one by one, navigating each of these stages. And if we navigate all of them in order, that we then become a well-formed adult with a well-formed ego. And Freud's idea had sequential stages that were essentially dependent on each other. And what I mean by that is if you didn't navigate stage 1 successfully, then you were stuck there. You could not successfully move on and navigate stage 2. To move through the entire sequence of stages, each one was dependent on the former stages in order for you to get to and through the subsequent stages, or else you just couldn't proceed in your full development. And so that's why we have terms like oral fixation, because someone is stuck in the oral stage, right? And they didn't move beyond it. So that was Freud's model. And after Freud, you also had a very popular model of human moral development by Erikson, which also borrowed that sequential stage model and said that when we humans go through our development and maturing in our moral character, that we develop our moral character through sequential stages that are essentially dependent as well. So this stage has to be successfully navigated in order to be able to successfully navigate the next one. Okay. So Freud writes in the early part of the 1900s. Erikson writes after that, same essential stage model. And that's the context in which Kubler-Ross is coming up with her model. And although she later revised this and said, no, I didn't really mean to have that essential sequence model, she kind of did. Also, the intuitive inner logic of her model, which I'll explain here in a second, supports the easy assignment of the sequential stage model. Okay, so Kubler-Ross put forth this model of grief, where it really was a stage model, and people today, if you go interview the next 10 people who walk down the street and say, do you know anything about grief? If they know anything, they know that there are stages of grief, and people can usually say at least a couple of them. Mostly people talk about the first two of denial and anger. So the logic of Kubler-Ross's model really does set up an internally coherent idea about it working as an essential stage model. Because basically what Kubler-Ross observed and wrote about was that when people were confronted with a terminal illness diagnosis, that what she was seeing and describing was, first, people just weren't accepting it and were then in a stage of denial. And yet when their acceptance started, they didn't jump from I'm not accepting this and dealing with it at all to I'm in a full state of deep acceptance of my imminent death and my mortality. What she found is that when people turned their focus toward the situation, that it was a diffuse negative response, right? And what is a diffuse negative response? Anger. Anger is a diffuse negative response. It's diffuse in that it's a generalized response, meaning not focused and specific often in terms of the emotional quality. And it's a negative response, not assigning a negative connotation, but it's a miserable, challenged state as opposed to a constructive, happy, positive state, right? And so first, not dealing with it, thus denial. Beginning to deal with it, but in a negative, diffuse way, anger. Okay. And because anger doesn't actually work to solve the situation. So, like, if I get a terminal diagnosis and I first just don't deal with it and then I get angry about it, my anger is not going to make that diagnosis go out of existence, right? It will not cure me. And so because anger is the response, but it fails, then something else comes after that, right? Because you have a failure of the anger response. And so what Kubler-Ross observed and wrote about was that when the diffuse negative response of anger didn't work, but they were still faced with, let's say, their disease progressing, and then they're confronting that existential crisis of their mortality and their morbidity, that then people tried to be focused on it, to solve it, to make it go away, but to do so in a more focused, less diffuse, and more constructive way. And what is more focused, more positive, and constructive? Bargaining. So bargaining is not negative like anger. Bargaining is more specific and targeted than the diffuse state of anger. And so basically people are saying, dear God, make my cancer go away, and I promise I'll go to church every Sunday for the rest of my life. So people bargain with themselves, they bargain with the universe, they bargain with God if they're religious. And the goal is, I want this to go away. I don't want this to be so. I don't want to be dealing with this crisis and dealing with my mortality and my morbidity. And so Kubler-Ross observed that people engaged in bargaining to try to deal with the thing, but still trying to make the thing go away. When bargaining fails, what else can happen? And Kubler-Ross observed that when bargaining fails, that is an existential crisis, because first you don't deal with it, then you deal with it in a negative way of being angry at it, and I just want it to go away because I'm so mad about this situation. Then I'm going to be constructive and make it and crafty and creative and make it go away, so I'm going to bargain. Then that fails. That represents an existential crisis, because I tried not dealing with it. I tried blasting it out of existence. I tried getting crafty and bargaining it out of existence. I got nothing at this point. And so it's a sense of powerlessness and loss of agency, loss of control, which she then described as depression, and the emotional quality being sadness, right? Depression isn't going to make cancer go away either, right? And so she thought that at some point people dig themselves out of that and find something that's not any of the former ones, that's not depression, that's not bargaining, that's not anger, that's not denial. And she thought that given enough time and inner resources and external supports, that then people had the opportunity, not all in the same way, on the same schedule, but if you have enough time, then you can get to a state of true acceptance. And so that's the logic of the Kubler-Ross model. And you can see how it really fits well with the fundamental idea of a sequential stage model: denial, anger, bargaining, depression, acceptance, right? One problem with this model, there are multiple problems with this model, is that if you look at yourself in terms of how you adjust to a change or loss, or you look at those near you, if we therapists look at the people that we're talking to about changes and losses, they don't fit into that model well in multiple ways. And one way is that the denial, anger, bargaining, depression, acceptance model in one way implicitly suggests that the stages are somewhat monochrome in their existence in terms of their presentation. So anger is a very specific emotional quality. And so, that means that someone might have anger and also have some other emotional qualities happening, because we have more than one emotion about the same thing at the same time. And they might think, wait, I must be grieving incorrectly. I'm crazy. I'm wrong. I'm not doing this right, because I'm feeling anger and I'm also feeling this other stuff too. And so one misguided notion of the Kubler-Ross stage model is that you're going to do stage by stage by stage, and you have to do one stage and then the next, which isn't true. And I'll get to again in a minute, but also that the stages are characterized by a kind of monochrome presentation. And so if you look at people, their experience and their reactions and what how they're making sense of the change and loss, it doesn't fit neatly into any of those stages, even when there's a predominant quality. Like they might have a moment where they are really angry at the person who's dying or has died, let's say. But there's also this other mix of stuff. Let me give you an example. I used to work in a critical care department for years. And part of that role included me working with people who were dying, working with families of people who were dying or had just died. And so there was one case that I will share that we had a patient who was in our critical care department and actively dying. And by actively dying, I mean we couldn't save him. And the family had decided to shut off the life support and let him naturally die, because what we were doing was only going to prolong his existence. He was not going to come back. And so, but the thing was about this patient was that I was there on the day that we were turning the machines off, and I was going to sit with the family members who were there, and the family members were like 3 of his cousins. And so I'm sitting in the room with the cousins, and we're getting to the point where we're going to turn the machines off. And they then were sharing with me their experience of that moment, which did include anger. They were mad at him for dying because what had happened was about a year before he had gone through a terrible relationship breakup that he did not cope with well. And his main coping strategy was to drink hard liquor all day, every day. This is not an uncommon situation, right? So he was drinking, by the time he died, he was drinking like a gallon of vodka a day. And so this patient, was drinking all this liquor and basically killed himself with, because you can't drink a gallon of vodka a day, by the way, in case you didn't know that. And so his body was shutting down. There was too much alcohol. So they were mad at him. But while I'm sitting there with them, they were also sharing with me that he was a really great guy and he had a really great sense of humor, and he did all these funny things in his life and played practical jokes on people. And so they were sharing all these stories about him and feeling joy, remembering that, and laughing. So they're simultaneously laughing and they're crying and they're also angry. So they've got sadness, they've got anger, they've got joy and laughter as the mix. Now, with the Kubler-Ross model, if they invoke that in some moment, they're going to think, "Oh my God, this is crazy. It's crazy that I'm simultaneously mad and I'm also sad and I'm also laughing, and he's not even dead yet. Like, what am I supposed to do with that part?" So the experience often at any given moment in the process of dealing with grief is a mixed bag. And that's one way that the stage model is a disservice, because it makes people feel like I'm not doing it right because I'm not having a predominantly, let's say, angry moment. And the other thing is, what if I have a process of adjustment to a change or loss where I don't even have a certain stage that the stage model would say is essential, right? Because, like, for example, I was teaching a workshop one time. I used to teach workshops to divorcing parents. I did this for years. I taught it to over 5,000 parents over a 15-year period. And we talked about emotions and grief in that workshop. And there was this one workshop where I talked about grief and emotions and adjustment, both in terms of parents adjusting and children adjusting to divorce. And when I got to the point where I asked if there were any questions, there was this couple in the workshop, and they raised their hands and they said, hey, we've got a question. And I said, well, what's your question? And they said, well, our son knows that we are getting divorced because we have told him that we're going to separate and get divorced. But he doesn't seem to be angry about it at all. Like none, no anger whatsoever. And so do we need to talk to him more so that he can understand more about the divorce? Therefore, he can get angry in order to get through his grief? Now, I hadn't introduced the Kubler-Ross model to set that up for them. They were speaking out of the fact that, that is the convention that we receive in our society because it's so popular. So in their minds, they were thinking denial, anger, bargaining, depression, acceptance. We want our son to get to acceptance, and he's not showing any anger, so he can't get through all those stages because they're essentially dependent on each other, right? So misconception, total misconception. So, I told them, A, the short answer is no, don't worry about it. B, he's your son. He'll be angry at you about all kinds of things soon enough. So just wait a little bit and you will see anger about something. But that is a common idea. People will think, oh, I kind of look like I'm in this stage, therefore that's next. Or I'm not having this at all, therefore I must not be able to have that stage. And I need all the stages and I need them in order to be able to get to acceptance. Not true at all, right? And I'll get to the alternative model here in a little bit. But, when we did adhere more to the stage model earlier, we also just used to think, well, maybe people kind of move back and forth through the stages. It's still kind of this long track that has these predictable parts, but maybe people just kind of go forward and then backward and forward and backward. That's not true either, because it's not a track with neat little predictable stages that have these very monochrome kinds of presentations. It does not happen that way. So part of the takeaway, the so what here is, if you're feeling a mix of things about a change or loss that you have experienced, there's a 99.9% chance that you're totally fine and okay. If you're really worried about it and you need somebody to help you make sense of it and sort through it, we therapists are the people who can help you do that. But in reality, you're probably okay. Most of the people who come to me in therapy and say, I feel like I'm not doing this right, when we talk about it, it turns out they are. And the other thing about this model that I want to revisit, that was kind of part of the earlier examples I gave, is that the model has denial, anger, bargaining, depression, acceptance. And if you think about positive emotion, it doesn't really exist until you get to the stage of acceptance, right? And in the example I gave, where I'm sitting in the critical care department while the patient's dying and the family is having a mix of both challenged and positive emotional responses, that's normal, right? And so you're not crazy if you're having challenged, adjustment to a change or loss. You are having challenging emotions like sadness and anger, but that there are times where you're having positive emotions, either about the person or the situation or about something else. Like I talked to this one patient one time whose father had died, and she was about 3 months out from his death. And so she had kind of socially retracted, like a lot of people do, because she just didn't want to deal with other people and other people's reactions to her situation. And so she was just kind of being a hermit while she was in the early stages of adjustment. But her close friends that she used to get together with weekly and watch a funny sitcom with, they reached out to her and they said, hey, look, you may not be ready for this, but whenever you want to join us, we're happy to have you join us for our weekly thing again. And so one week she decided, yeah, I'm going to go hang out with my friends. So she's hanging out with her friends. They're watching the funny sitcom. And in the middle of it, she found herself laughing. And she hadn't been laughing about anything because she'd been in this sort of more sad, morose state for weeks. And she's laughing at this funny thing in the sitcom. And she instantly felt shame, and because she thought, I'm not supposed to be doing this. Laughter and joy are not part of grief. And I'm not supposed to be laughing because I'm supposed to just be sad. It's supposed to be this monochrome stage of depression, right? Again, this is part of what she's telling me as her therapist, and she's reporting to me, I feel shame and I think I'm crazy or wrong. And in fact, it was totally normal, totally sane, totally normal. So just know that you have a mix of experiences. It's not a monochrome, totally negative state. And it's also going to change up in lots of different ways. So that's part of what I want to say about the stage model and why it really doesn't work if you want to try to fit yourself or people in general into that model of grief. Some people look like that. It's certainly a neat, tidy, intuitive model in the way that I explained earlier, but it's inadequate in terms of the wide range of the ways that we experience change and losses and adjust to them. So here's what we do instead these days. These days, we think about what's called a task-centered model. And there's this guy, Worden, W-O-R-D-E-N, that we kind of attribute a lot of this to because he wrote a lot about this. And so we kind of continue to just adapt Worden's ideas about this. But basically, Worden posited, and this is the task model, and you can go Google tasks of grief, and you'll probably see a top hit on that. It'll be a Psychology Today article, which is actually a really good read. But the task model says that there are these multiple tasks, and when we experience a change in loss, we may be engaged in 1, 2, 3, 4, simultaneously. So they're not sequential stages that are dependent on each other. You don't have to do task 1 and then task 2 and then task 3 and so on. There just happen to be multiple tasks. And our psyche is often engaged in the tasks in a gestalt, a complicated mix simultaneously rather than trying to do them one by one. And so the four tasks of the task model in the ways that we respond to grief are: number one, accepting the loss and actually starting to respond as though the loss has occurred. And that means the fundamental: yes, my pet did die. Yes, my person did die. Yes, I did lose my job, or whatever the change or loss happens to be. Intellectually going ahead and acknowledging, accepting, and beginning the process of, this is what I'm dealing with, even though this in that sentence is going to unfold as you come to know what this means moving on. Accepting the loss. Number two, experiencing as constructively as possible the emotional pain of the change or the loss. So we have to be able to experience congruent, constructive, proportionate emotions to the different things that we experience and have to adjust to as the loss occurs or comes toward us, occurs, and we move on beyond it. And that's an ongoing process. And again, it's not just about anger. It's not just about sadness. It may be a mix of emotions. It may be an evolving mix of emotions that looks different from one minute to the next, right? Third task is adjust to the loss. And this means everything from the practical adjustment, like, for example, my grandmother had never opened a checkbook in her life before my grandfather died, and he died before her. And part of the practical level of adjusting to his loss was she had to learn how to write a check. So there are these mundane levels of adjustment that are necessary to practically adjust to a loss. But when we talk about adjustment to a loss, we really also talk about adjusting to a new identity of, here I am, I'm me after that loss, and also adjusting to the new relationship of the person who's no longer alive, or the new situation where the former isn't happening, but now the current one is. And that also relates to task two, because as we adjust in all the different levels to a change or loss, we also do what's called emotionally relocating the loss. And so the second task I mentioned was being able to constructively feel and respond to the feelings that get triggered through that process. One aspect of that is that we move forward in time, and the emotional experience, it comes along with us, but it evolves because the experience is situated in a certain point in our chronological timeline, and it moves into our past. And that's what we mean by emotional relocation of a loss. So the fourth task is basically a deeper integration of the entire process, where we change our relationship to the situation, that the former situation or the person who has died, and we basically form a new relationship with ourself as someone who experienced that person or pet or situation, whatever it happens to be. And so basically we rework our relationship with that person, because that person is going to come along with us. But it's not that we're bringing the past along with us. We're reworking our present so that our past is synthesized and integrated in a deeply constructive way, in an optimal world. As we grow beyond our former self, that was the self that existed before the loss or the change happened, our life moves forward and we go beyond that, but we have to actively basically construct our new self with a new relationship of how that former thing comes along with us in as constructive a way as possible, and we move ahead in our life in as optimally constructive a way as possible. So the task model, that's a four-task model. There are other task models out there, but that's the most popular one. It's the one that I apply. But, obviously a lot more could be said about what does that actually mean for me? What does that mean for you in coping with and adjusting to a change or a loss? And I will make some subsequent videos that go into deeper detail about some of those different aspects of coping. Obviously, if you need, close support to cope with a change or loss, see a therapist because that's part of what we do. But that's just an overview of what I wanted to say today about grief because the stage model is inadequate and it's problematic in the ways that I described. The task model says we do the tasks simultaneously, and the tasks as defined in the task model are also ones that give us a lot more latitude in the range and qualities of the elements of each of those experiences in terms of how we're experiencing and adjusting to change and loss. If you want to read a good book on grief, of all the books I've encountered through my whole career on grief, the one that I think is if you're going to buy one book on grief, the best one out there is Resilient Grieving by Lucy Hone, Hone. I'll put a link down in the description here. Very good book. You can also Google Hone and Resilient Grieving and listen to interviews she's given because she's given some really great talks on the topic. But I think she has a lot of good advice in her book about how to deal with grief because grief is very complicated. It's very challenging. It's one of the most challenging things we do in life. And it's also challenging because not only does the stage model not give us an adequate kind of guide to get through the territory, but grief is challenging to how we share it with others or don't. And because it's such an overwhelming situation, it's often private, which means we don't actually see how other people are actually grieving out there in our world in order for us to make sense of it, which is another reason why we might feel kind of alone or crazy in our own process. So hope this was helpful. If you like this kind of content, feel very free to hit the like button below and comment, subscribe, and share widely if you like it. And I will see you on this topic again in the near future because I'm going to do a series of videos on the topic of grief. Thanks.